Peter Dower,
Oh, here.
Sarah Chivilicek. Here. James Barnes,
Here.
Larry Chesney,
Here.
James Hewins. Ed Hawkins.
Here.
Frank Peterson,
Here.
Diane Vanderwell. Here. Kevin Weisstein.
Here.
And Mary Brock.
Here.
Great, thanks. We'll move on to item number 2, salute to the flag, and we'll have Commissioner Brock lead us this evening.
Fellow commissioners and guests, I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Move on to item number 3, approval of the agenda. Looking for a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, thank you. Move on to item 4, public comment.
I have no public comment.
Anyone wishing to make a public comment this evening? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to item 5, which is our business of the day and our draft 2019 Truckee Meadows Regional Plan Policies Workshop, the reason we are all here this evening. Kim, I'll turn it over to you for an intro.
Thanks very much. So yes, we are here this evening for a workshop on regional plan policy. The conversation, how we structured this evening, is to do a walkthrough each policy section. So 2 weeks ago, we provided you with a full policy crosswalk package, and we were hoping you'd take a look at that so that there's a lot of opportunity for discussion and questions. Like I said, we're going to go policy or section by section, and within that, there will be discussions by policy. We also provided at the meeting 2 weeks ago a list of polarizing items. You'll see those flagged up on the screen with a red flag. All the discussion tonight will be captured, and we'll be utilizing it for version 2 of the draft policies. Just a reminder, the policy elements are population growth, regional form, natural resources, public facilities and services, regional coordination. And what we've done is structure a slide for each of those sections that captures some of the conversation, like I said, and provides a little bit of the polarizing item piece. And I'm going to turn it back to the chair so you can describe the workshop process.
Great. So Kim outlined it, but the intent tonight through our workshop is, like Kim said, to go through each of these sections and look at the policies, the draft policies, use the polarizing spreadsheet that we have kind of to guide us to those more hot topic items. The Commission should know that we have a lot of experts and resources in the room this evening. Local jurisdiction staff, a lot of the affected entity staff are here also to help us get answers to questions or feedback on concerns that we might have. But our objective tonight is really to do the best we can getting through these policies and providing that feedback to staff so this can roll into an updated version of the policies. So that is our approach for 5A.
We'll turn it over to Jeremy to start with the conversation on population growth.
Great.
Thank you. Jeremy Smith, for the record. So population growth, well, what we've done here is we've tried to move some of the work we do in what's called the consensus forecast directly into the regional plan itself. And some of the reasoning behind that is the first element of our NRS statute 278.0274 includes asks for a projection of population, right, and the services that would need to be needed to serve that population. So to date, the consensus forecast has been a document that lives sort of outside of our regional plan. It's done every 2 years. It was initially done by Washoe County. We took over doing that forecast in 2014. So we've done it 14, 16, 18, 3 times. It just seems like for ease of use and to find it a little bit easier, it would be nice to have it right there in the regional plan because it really does lead to some of the policies that follow behind in terms of a regional form and what we're trying to do with public facilities. So that was really kind of the first thing we wanted to do with population growth, and the idea being that over the period that we've been doing the forecast, we haven't seen a tremendous amount of change in what the forecast is showing. That's especially true of the 2016 and 2018 forecast. So we thought it would be probably sufficient to look at that population forecast every 5 years with the plan update. However, we're also going to be doing a more informal version where we use 3 of the 4 data sources, and this is really a cost expense reason behind this, but every year as part of our annual report, we would be looking at, is the forecast changing? What are we seeing this year? And then go to the next year, what are we seeing? We include that in our annual report. So if we saw a significant deviation, I think initially I put out a 15% number, but I think we could do a little bit more work on exactly what the threshold ought to be in terms of deviating. Maybe it's less, maybe it's 10%, and we can look at how it's deviated over time in terms of the existing consensus forecast to do that. Then we would go ahead and spend the additional money to acquire that 4th source, which right now is the IHS Global Insight source, and it's around $10,000 to $11,000 for Washoe County. So that's what we wanted to maybe avoid buying that every 2 years. But then we'd go through a regional plan amendment process, and we would update the in-plan forecast to reflect that significant change. In talking with some of our partners and affected entity staff, folks are a little concerned that 5 years may be too long between forecasts, even if it's not changing. And so I think we're trying to work into the second draft of our policies that, if folks feel it's appropriate for their agency to use the most current forecast of that year from the annual report, that would be an option. And I think we'll need to figure out also how frequently we want to address the concept of spatial disaggregation, which is a job that we've been doing at least since I started, and I think previous to that, maybe jurisdictional staff provided information about where they thought future units would locate and future jobs to, say, like the RTC to run in a transportation demand model. So we've been doing that spatial disaggregation work with the GIS model we've created, and I think there's still some discussion to figure out how frequently we ought to be doing the disaggregation. But we'll absolutely be tracking things like the absorption of where a unit's locating every year in terms of our annual report. So that kind of information will be available. Moving on, there's a couple other policies in this section. One of them is about checking sustainable water resources. This is something that we've been doing since we've taken over the forecast as well. And it was in a third document, or another document rather, it was in the RPG regulations and rules on procedure. And it really is a process where we go and we talk to, we take our population forecast, go to the Northern Nevada Water Planning Commission and say, are there identified sustainable water resources to support this 20-year population forecast? And they look at what Jim Smitherman and others have done in the regional water management plan, and if that's the case, then they'll make a recommendation to the Western Regional Water Commission to also see if they can make that same finding. And if that all goes well, then we take that to the Regional Planning Commission, this body, to approve the consensus forecast. So we would plan to do that same water check, or check in on water resources, every 5 years at the least. And if we were to do an amendment process that required us to go in there and actually update the forecast of the plan, we would do it at that time as well. Because if it's changed significantly, we want to make sure we're checking it against those water resources. Another kind of key topic is this idea of how we might limit the expansion of the Truckee Meadows services area. We've done quite a bit of work over the years to try to figure out how much land use has been planned through the master planning process within the TMSA. And as it stands right now, from what we've looked at, there's more than enough to support 20 years of growth, and it's probably more like 40 to 50 years of growth, especially depending on how you might change some of the master planning in areas that are currently pretty low density, or how well we're able to make use of our mixed use areas that we've zoned. So that's another policy we're trying to, I think it's PG7. The polarizing one, which is that red flag item down there, where we're kind of stuck, I guess, in the working group, is this idea of jurisdictional splits. So to date, when I have done the spatial disaggregation, I've had sort of preset targets on where I should be putting population. And those break down basically 25% of the forecasted units, or forecasted people, which I end up converting to units, would go to the TOD and center geographies. as they exist today, and so that's right up the top. And then there would be basically a historic share. We look at the total share of population in the 3 jurisdictions of City of Greenhouse, City of Sparks, and Washoe County. And we've been using that then to guide sort of where we disaggregate population to. I think one of the things that we've noticed is that we're not necessarily hitting 25% off the top into these TOD geographies, although it has been very encouraging as of late. I would say the past 3 to 5 years, we've been seeing a pretty significant uptick in development in those areas, so that's pretty promising. But prior to that, it was actually fairly low.
To get an overview from staff on the whole section before we jumped into it, so.
That's pretty much
Okay.
the overview.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So now is the point where we're going to dive in and look at the policies. You have the policies in your packet. Before let's see, how do we want to structure this? So before we get into the policies, we can have questions for Jeremy or anyone else in the room globally on the section. If you'd like, or we can just dive right into the policies and we can do those global questions as we work through it. What's the pleasure of the commission on how to approach it?
I think globally, and then if we can, and I maybe she said.
Well, let's get those global questions first.
I have a global
Okay.
question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is with Jeremy. With it, because you've been talking, have been discussing the disaggregation, but if I remember correctly, you said that each individual one of those polygons can be aggregated. Is that, am I remembering that correctly?
Which polygons?
Well, as we look at the map, when you say, and you do a rollover all of that, it tells you what's there.
In terms of like the hexagon polygons I've
Yes.
shown? Yes,
So they can,
exactly.
because they can go back, they can be aggregated based on, I guess we have a roll.
That's right,
What's
yeah.
in that home.
You can actually click on it and it will tell you what's there today. Yep, and you're welcome.
Okay. Other global questions? All right, let's dive in and look at PG1. Who has questions, needs clarification, didn't understand it, everyone's okay with it? Let's talk about it. Who wants to start? Nobody? You're good with PG1?
Yes.
Good. I'll put it on the record then. My thought with PG1 is that if we're talking about these as policies, I didn't understand what the policy is. It sounds like the methodology to me. So it's more of a structure question. Where does it live? Does it live as a policy? Does it live as a, methodology component of the document? I think there were, Jeremy, a couple of those policies that, there's just a lot of technical information in the policy, so it's, thinking about making it accessible to the folks who are reading it.
Okay.
So if I can add to that, Chair, is that, so if going off your slide here, Jeremy, is the policy statement, is that the consensus forecast lives in the plan and that it'll be in there, or what are we, because as Peter brings that up, I do agree with that.
I think that's a really good point, and possibly it could really be a front matter, and that lives in front of the in front of maybe the first policy. I guess the idea was that we wanted to make sure that we weren't didn't have the capacity to update the forecast if it were to change, significantly. But PG2 is, I think you're right, is more in the policy realm where it says all master plans and effective ending plans must, use this forecast. So I think there could be a way forward where it's not necessarily a policy. Good call.
That's just one of 9, on this commission. It's just the intent to provide that kind of feedback to staff. Anything that's on the top of your mind as you read through these, feel free to blurt it out or, that information on the table. So how about PG2? No, okay. How about PG3?
Chair?
Yeah.
Yes, I think Jeremy, when he was doing his presentation, addressed it for me because every 5 years with the update of the regional plan, I think is too much time. And I think too many things happen. So if doing the consensus work, if you're suggesting that we can update it with an annual report, and then if we see that numbers are skewed either lower or higher, that we'll update it that way?
Yes.
So we're gonna get wording in there like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now,
Okay.
it's a plus or minus 15%, but I think feedback is that that's probably too wide of a deviation, maybe 5 to 10 is probably better.
Okay, all right. That was the only one on PG3 for me.
Commissioner Weisky, do you have the funding to do it more often, Jeremy?
Well, if we do the 3 sources, it's actually very inexpensive. It's from the state demographer, so that's just publicly available. That's one source. Then our partners at Tumblr had to share Sean's statistical forecast, so that's basically given to us gratis. And then we use a Woods and Pool product, which I think is on the order of $250 to $400. And historically, we've used the IHS Global Insight product, and we've just tried, to stay consistent with that. And it really, I believe the last time we purchased it, it was $11,000. So it could be built into the budget. Currently, it's a 2-year purchase.
I mean, you would have an idea in watching growth changes as you're coming up to a 3-year mark, if you will, if you're going to need to update it beforehand, right? So this would be something that wouldn't be stopped in its tracks because the budget for that year didn't have the allocable funds available to get you the information you need.
Mr. Chair, if I
Yeah,
may.
go ahead.
Kim Robinson for the record. So the conversation around if we have the money in the budget, I think that because the jurisdictions are responsible for providing us with our budget, we can talk about the need for that on a yearly basis. And I certainly think that if part of what comes out of the conversation is that the RPC says, we think it's important to have this every year or every other year or a certain amount of time, that's something that will just then be rolled into the work program, and it will become, this is something that we need to be able to purchase on a every other year basis or yearly basis, whatever that conversation is. So in terms of the budget conversation, I would suggest that, that's something that could probably be worked out.
Okay.
Okay. All right, let's move on to PG4. Pretty much carry forward, right, from previous plan relative to, it's going to be consistent with the regional water management plan.
Correct, yeah, previously lived in the rules on procedure, and regulations on procedure, and just trying to consolidate it all in the same spot. But maybe it's a little too techy for this document.
Okay, any questions on that? PG5.
Chair, how would you like staff to participate in this? Just pop in when we have questions, or listen, or?
Yeah, let's do that. I mean, we want it to be a participatory, get everything out on the table, have the discussion kind of format. So, yeah.
Well, maybe I'll pop in. This is an area that we're a little concerned about the draft policy, and we've done a little bit of additional research over the last couple of weeks. As we read this would.
And PG5, Arlo?
PG5, correct. So the new methodology.
Arlo, were you just, for the other commissioners
Oh, I'm
who might not
sorry.
know who you are?
My name's Arlo Stockham. I'm the new Community Development Director with City of Reno. I think I know many of you, but not all of you. So sorry for just jumping in here. I had a prior stint here in the region, and I was away for a little bit, and now I'm back.
Okay.
So anyway, from City of Reno, the current 25% off the top has been very helpful in directing public funding to RTC in particular, to projects in the core. This methodology looks more to the past than to the future, and we're concerned that it would result in diminished investments in our core areas. Sienna, we can get into the data a little more if you'd like. She dug up some historical information on the housing units we've permitted recently. Specifically in the last 5 years, over 26% of our housing units have come into what are currently defined as centers and corridors, which is close to, but a little bit above, the 25% off the top, at least within the city of Reno. Our concern is that by going back, the first methodology, percent share of population, is basically all based on the past. The second, going back 20 years, starts to get towards current trends, but we really didn't see momentum towards infill development under the existing plan until more recently. That captured the recession. There was a bunch of unused housing stock from before the recession. So it really has been a pretty dramatic shift in the last 5 years, where we have over 25% of our homes coming into our core areas. And with all the pre-development activity we're seeing and the projects in process, we think that's going to increase, not decrease. So we'd support a methodology that at a minimum retains the 25% number, ideally increases it or has some other mechanism to reflect that our goal is to direct more of the growth towards infill areas and redevelopment. And the real key way to do that is through investments, public investments. RTC is doing bus rapid transit, and they're working on bike paths and things like that that really support reinvestment in the core. And we're just a little concerned that this policy as written would kind of move in the other direction and potentially diminish some of our redevelopment efforts. And Sienna has those statistics if you'd like to look at them, but it really changed quite a bit in the last 5 years, and that's what we're hoping to capture.
I'd like to ask the commission if there are follow-up questions on Arlo's comments. Commissioner Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is for Mr. Stockham and then Jeremy as well. Jeremy, when you first initially said is that when you talked about that 25% right off the top, that they hadn't been, that the TOD had, and the centers, they hadn't been reaching that number. So how are you saying, Mr. Stockham, that, given what Jeremy's research has done in doing the plan, how are you now saying that you really see that?
Well, we dug up actual permits. Sienna can hand out the spreadsheet. I think the difference is in the time frame. Yeah. If I'm correct, Jeremy was looking back 20 years, and we looked back 5 years, which we believe is more reflective of what we're going to see moving forward. I think the 20-year data is not a real reflection of what's happening today, because it includes recession. It includes the recession. It includes growth kind of approved before the current plan framework really called for growth. Correct. And when you look at 5 years to current, it goes, I think Jeremy's number was what, 8% or something over a 20-year horizon?
I ran some numbers as well, and kind of depends on how you slice it. Using a percent can be a little bit misleading because every year there's a different number of units that are actually built. Correct. But if you just take a straight percent, my 5-year average came out to 18.32%.
And that may be the case regionally. We just did the city of Reno building.
So we might be, it might be a semantics issue here because you're saying permitted and Jeremy is saying built.
Mr. Chair, can I add something?
Please.
Commissioner Shubelchek, something, because it's an average, if you look at Victorian Square, for example, downtown Sparks, if you took a 20-year average for approximately 16 of those years, you'd have 0. And then in 4 years, you'd have a huge number of units being constructed. So utilizing the average methodology doesn't help because of the trends that have happened most recently. And that does undermine the percentage that goes there. Now, Jeremy and I have spoken about this for a long time, and we agree that there shouldn't necessarily just be a 25% allocation to the TOD. But to utilize an average methodology, I don't think works over 20 years because of the trends that have changed in the last couple of years.
And our real goal is, if anything, to prioritize investment in the core areas over outlying areas. So if we err on this number, however the methodology is, our feeling is that a higher percentage should go towards infill supporting investments rather than a lower percentage.
Just to quickly follow up, I think we absolutely agree, and our plan is focused. We want to see infill, and that's how we've tried to prioritize the regional form map. But over the years, there's been discussion around being realistic, right? And making sure that we're not just picking a number, and that we actually have a feel for what's really been going on. And I agree, it has been increasing in the past few years after the recession, absolutely. There are a lot of planned developments that aren't in these areas, and there's a significant number of units, and there's a bit of a balance, I think, that also needs to be achieved between, there's only so many units to allocate in a 20-year time frame when you're doing this disaggregation. And so when we send the data to the RTC in the traffic analysis zone format, sometimes developments get 0 units added, right? Because we only have 44,000 or however many units the forecasts are telling us we need to sort of move around. And then there can be sort of ramifications on the other side where we want to make sure we're doing the investments in terms of where we're building, say if it's in the North Valleys or in Spanish Springs as well. So I think we agree generally on what we're trying to do. I just think we need to be as realistic as possible about how we handle just taking a share off the top.
If I may, thank you. So Jeremy, if I'm hearing you correctly, so when you ran your numbers, did you do it on this 20 years, and then did you do it on a 5-year?
I did 2010 and 5, yep,
Okay.
and I looked at dwelling units as we tracked them in our database, and basically just overlaid the existing center and TOD geographies, which do look like they've changed in the existing, from our regional plan today to what the City of Reno master plan is now and what the Sparks master plan is. But the numbers that I was able to do over 20 years, about 11% going to those areas. In 10 years, about 15, and then the 5-year was about 18%. And again, the percentage can be misleading in terms of total units, because, for example, in, say, 2010, which we know is a really bad year for development in general, right? There was only 429 units, as we're tracking it, built throughout the entire TMSA. 4 of them seem to be in Todd Center areas. However, this last year, almost 3,800 units, and 749 of them were built in TOD and center areas. So I think it is changing, and I think we do want to find the right mechanism to make sure that that there's a link, right, between what we're doing in terms of population forecasting and investments. Now, RTC is a good example because we do provide the TAZ data to the RTC. So where we put this population in the TAZs matters. However, they also do other ancillary studies, like the North Valley study they completed a few years ago. They're currently engaged in a South Valley study. And those also influence how they sort of create their list of improvements in the RTP. So we're a major source of that information, but not necessarily the only source.
Mr. Kerr with you.
I want to get to Commissioner Weisky here.
Thank you. Jeremy, it sounds to me like it's a methodology issue that is creating this.
Could be, yeah.
So
Yeah.
is one right, is one wrong? Is this a math problem, or is this a scientific problem which has hypotheses and theories and lots of different angles to attack it from? Which is it? I mean, is it black and white, or is it all gray? And
I guess for me, I'm against an arbitrary number of 25%, but I am absolutely in favor of looking at the information and trying to build the model to reflect what's really happening.
okay, so with that in mind, then it needs to kind of, it sounds to me like it needs to be an agreement then between regional and the cities or county involved in, how the numbers are developed. I can tell you from development and commercial construction that from 2000 to 2008, our development world was a lot different then than it is today. The developers spending the money in the early 2000s had property in the outlying areas of the TMSA, and that's what they were developing and building. Now, our developers are different investors, different developers, and they are coming in and doing infill projects. So to look back and do a comparison that's 20 years old or more, especially with an 8 to 10 year block in the middle where nothing happened, is askew to what we're looking at now. Why, or it appears to me that we're not looking at the most current data for the near future projection. Am I wrong?
Well, I don't know that you're wrong. I think what you said was correct. And I think that over the next 20 years, it's highly possible that it will ebb and flow again. And that we might not be doing exactly what we're doing this 3 years to maybe even the next 10 years. And the following 10 years may be shifted to the outlying areas. So I think we just need to be cognizant that because we're seeing it right now, it doesn't mean necessarily that it will continue to the future. And because we've seen it over 20 years, doesn't mean that it will do that again either.
Right. I mean, when you look at it over the last 20 years, you see a more well-rounded
Correct.
picture. I get it.
Yeah.
But for the immediate 5-year plan that we're working on, and knowing that development cycles in this area, at least over the last 35 plus years I've been involved with, are 5 to 8 year cycles, pretty close to that. And I think the Realtors Board has numbers to support that.
Sure.
That you can start to project. Right now there's a big push on infill.
Absolutely.
With what I see for development opportunities outside the area, except for a couple of large PUDs, chances are they're going to be smaller developments, whether it's in the core or in the outlying areas. But I'm more focused on how do we get the methodology right so that everybody is in agreement here and it can be moved on. I mean, if that's what you guys are asking the Planning Commission to do, then we need to know what methodology is right. That's my bottom line right now.
If I could, for the record, Santa Reed, Senior Planner with the City of Reno. We're certainly happy to continue working in terms of sharing data. We did go back and do an analysis of actually constructed dwelling units, so we are using the same data source.
Sure, good.
We really wanted to focus on 5 years, noting all of the changed conditions. We have moved on from the recession. We really do feel that in looking towards the future, we should be asking ourselves, should the regional plan be promoting infill and redevelopment? And if so, should we be directing population and planning for appropriate infrastructure and facilities to support it in those areas? So it really is a policy question around regional form and pattern. We're very excited that we've seen increasing amounts of growth to these areas, and I actually think Jeremy and I are saying the same thing with our data. The recent trend is showing that that's where development is occurring. And so we can share data, we can, continue to be involved in discussions about what's the right number, but at the end of the day, there is a policy question around, should we be directing population and employment to infill and redevelopment areas over time to support a more compact urban form? And I think that's really what we want to do from the City of Reno's perspective.
Sienna, do you think that this policy as it is now is not doing that? I mean, we're setting the methodology aside.
We think the 25% has been an effective tool to help infrastructure planning efforts think about where are you going to have population and employment in these infill and redevelopment areas. So how do we plan for water lines that need to be upsized? How do we plan for multimodal transportation investments? What do those look like? Those have really started to be successful. I think as mentioned, you're seeing the improvements to Midtown, the improvements to East 4th Street. Those are all as a result of thinking about what types of infrastructure need to accommodate population in infill and redevelopment areas.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
I just received a question from Vice Chair Chivilicek that I think was a very good one, which is, I don't see this 25% number here anywhere. Where is that from?
Right.
So it's from the current plan, right? The conversation of pods and centers in the current plan. And again, the population, 25% of the population growth over the next 20 years going into those areas. I can say that when we started having the conversation around the number, right? Whether it's 25% or 7% or any of those other numbers, what we really started with was the conversation that 25% was a number that was picked years ago. It was not necessarily a data-driven number, it was an aspirational number. And so the conversation that we have consistently tried to have in the room is, okay, if that's the case, what is the right number? And I think personally that the work that Sienna's brought to the table in terms of conversation around the kind of growth in the TODs, what Jeremy's looking at too, I think there is a number. I don't think anybody's kind of disagreeing about that. It's a conversation of, so how do we decide what it is? Do we stick with what's been there for a while, admittedly aspirational, or do we modify that to some extent based on what we know and how we make that choice? So.
Okay, so Commissioner Weisky, Kim,
Yeah.
Let's pick another random number. Let's pick 15%, just for easy math, okay? And if 15% is the number that is agreed upon, then what is a reasonable margin of error or growth in that number to expand it to, so that we're projecting for the future? Is it a 3% number? Is it a 5% number? So if the data-driven number is 15%, and everybody agrees on that, then do we add 3% to that and make it 18% as the goal, or do we make it 20%? Is there a magic cushion number?
Kim Robinson, for the record. That's a great question, and this is part of the art of planning, I think, in terms of the conversation. I will say that on page 5 of your draft policies, one of Jeremy's suggestions here was that we use split ranges, because no matter what the number is, it's not going to be right. We're not going to get the number exactly right. We can do our best. So what is the best way to talk about growth, where we think it should go, right? I think that's the conversation that we're trying to get to. The answer is, I don't have a perfect number to tell you exactly what it should be, nor an additional perfect number to kind of go on top of that. We'll do the best work that we can based on the data that we have. And to me, it's a mix of what's our history, because I think we're going to ebb and flow, right? So it's a mix of what happened 10 years ago, what's happened 5 years ago, what do we think may potentially happen kind of in the future, and it's something that we settle on together. But I think, just the conversation around being able to bring information to that and make that decision together is what's most important, I think, in the conversation that we've been having. I know that's not as definitive as probably you want.
You know me too well.
Chair, we were just having a little side discussion. Jeremy has great data, and it's trending in the right direction. If I understand, over 20 years, we're at 11%. Just looking back 10 years, 15%. 5 years, we're at 18%. So we're trending towards that 25% number. If we're looking to continue that trend 20 years into the future, maybe that would be a sensible methodology to use, is look at the trends of what's been happening, project that forward. We don't have any indication in Reno that the trend towards infill development is going to diminish. If anything, we think it's going to increase, because we have a limited land supply on the fringe. It's public land, it's slopes, and we have a lot of big projects in pre-application, construction. We expect to see greater than 25% moving forward, significantly greater. So maybe just to suggest a methodology, use those trends and skate to where the puck's going, not to where it was.
Jeremy, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think we maybe talked about that a little bit, trying to, and I've always kind of read this 25% comes from the existing consensus forecast, and we've been implementing it as 25% off the top immediately, but it does seem to make more sense that over time, we do an annual disaggregation. So we could be doing 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, we could be doing that over the 20-year period. So I think that would be a good approach to try to implement. Another thing is that possibly, because we agree, we need to encourage investment into the core area, because there is rehab that needs to be done. There's sort of maybe some mystery around what exactly is in the ground or what shape it's in. I think there are some other ways we can bolster that with maybe some just policy statements, maybe around the public infrastructure side of things in the plan, that don't just rely on the population estimates to drive that, but maybe there's even a stronger way we can just write in there to encourage that we should be prioritizing investments. And our regional forum, ideas, I think, support that in terms of a hierarchy, trying to see growth in the core. We're getting ahead of ourselves here, tier 1, tier 2, and then into the rural area. So maybe that can help.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Sarah Chevelchuk for the record. What I would certainly support is using numbers that are based on real data. And I also know that when anomalies happen, such as recessions, code can be factored into that can give you an adjusted growth when those kind of anomalies happen, because it's fuzzy, but it can be drilled down.
Sure.
So I would support projections based on real data, not just an arbitrary data.
Armando Ornelas, Assistant Community Services Director for Sparks. So I want to emphasize sort of Sienna's point, which is really about the policy here. I think if the purpose of allocating population to the centers and quarters, or core in particular, is really about trying to direct public investment in infrastructure and facilities to that area to support population growth, then I think that's a real issue. I think the trend in terms of the number is actually, it's going to be difficult to sustain the trend over time, because, for example, in Sparks, all the low-hanging fruit in terms of the most developable parcels for multifamily units, are being developed now. So, it took years and years and years to assemble land at Victoria Square, and it's being built out in a 5 to 6 year period. And then, what comes after that will be much harder. Same thing in the area around the marina in that redevelopment district. So in total, we have maybe 2,500 units either have been constructed or are under construction or planned in those two areas. Those are the easiest 2,500 units that we're going to get in that part of town. To keep the trend going, maybe not at the same level of increase, but to keep the trend going, we're really going to have to incentivize investment in that area by making appropriate public investments to attract that additional investment. So I think in my view, that's the real point in terms of what we're trying to achieve here with whatever we're saying the priority is for infrastructure and facility investments in the urban core.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Michael Barnes with Stonegate. We spend a lot of money on marketing analysis, trying to understand trends as well. It's our business to understand that. What we specifically, when we deal with the marketing people, we deal with the drivers. And it's kind of what Jeremy talks to. There's reasons, and somewhat to what Armando said, if there's low-hanging fruit, properties that are easy to develop, those get consumed, and all of a sudden the drivers change. Affordability is a big item, right? Obviously, there's a certain threshold people can afford. You may be targeting for downtown, but at one point downtown was relatively inexpensive. As it continues to go up, again, what is the drivers? And if affordability is one of the drivers, which I would think it would be, that has an effect on where the growth occurs and where your percentages grow. So you're trying to look in the future. It's difficult to look in the past. You need to understand what your drivers are in order to determine what trends.
Good point. Yeah. Good discussion. So I didn't hear anything from the county, RTC. Give you guys an opportunity to weigh in.
Well, thank you. Dan Dunges, Planning Manager with RTC. I would just echo what Jeremy said earlier. For when we take the data and plug it into our travel demand model, we're just wanting the most accurate data to program those investments as future investments and the most data-driven approach as possible. And as Jeremy did mention, we do pull from a lot of sources. It's not strictly based on our travel demand model, so there's a lot to weigh in there. Public input's a big one as well. So, but yeah, for what it's worth, if there's I don't have the magic bullet or the answer, but anything that I think would lead to more accurate data, as opposed to maybe an arbitrary number would be preferable from RTC's perspective. So.
Okay.
I'll say
Okay.
something. Hi, Moira Howenstein, Washington County Planning and Building Division Director. So on the 25%, Washington County is not as concerned with that because it doesn't affect us as much. But the jurisdictional splits, perhaps we should think of those differently. If we are going towards a regional format pattern that has tiers, perhaps the jurisdictional splits should mimic that. And again, that is a question for you to decide. However, those were kind of our thoughts, is that those jurisdictional splits should not be perhaps territorial, but more reflecting of the new construct, the tiering and the work.
Great. Commissioners, any other comments, questions? Magic bullets on this one? Okay. We're gonna move on then. PG6. Jeremy, again, my feedback on this one was that it was sort of methodological. Maybe that first sentence is the policy, and then the rest of it, talking about the disaggregation, is the methodology that maybe lives somewhere else, or that was just an observation. It's very meaty.
Sorry.
All right, PG7.
I'll jump in again on this one. This is
Yeah.
one of those biggies. I think there's, from hearing everyone, general consensus that we don't need to be looking at expansions to the TMSA now, and we should focus on filling in that existing area. That being said, we're a little bit concerned with the strict reliance on the growth model and basically saying thou shalt not approve any amendments in the future until it sounds like 20 years of supply is absorbed. And part of that thinking is a lot of the supply projections are based on capacity under zoning or approved projects. But in reality, a lot of those are not going to happen in the foreseeable future. And getting to the point on maybe it's housing affordability, or maybe there's some industrial, uses that tie in better with the Story County projects. There just may be situations where we don't want to, where some type of exception or different methodology would be appropriate, so we're not essentially preventing the governing board from approving expansions of this plan. We're not proposing any, but it seems a little bit rigid for our tastes.
Mr. Chair. So just a quick question. This does actually contemplate expansion of the TMSA, given special circumstances for documented regional needs. And actually provides, there is that kind of opportunity, because we don't actually think it's a good idea to back the governing board of the planning commission or all of us together into a corner. So if there is some feedback on perhaps talking about what these special circumstances look like, we can take this back to the working group. But just in terms of, there is something now, if there's feedback on how to make that better, we're very open to that.
Okay. Commissioner Weisky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, before I say anything, I want to preface it, Kim, you know this. Very seldom do I bring an issue to the table where I don't bring an option of an answer or a resolution, and I don't have an offer of a resolution at this time. But this is a concern that I had the last time we met, when we didn't get into the depth now because you were bringing more information forward to us, that from the private side, I understand what the government and the agency side is doing here, and I'm in agreement with that. But when I look at it from the private landholder side, I may not be prepared to develop my property in a 3 to 5 year period because of investment or growth or infrastructure starting to grow, but I may be at year 8 not year 21. And it has a combination of things to do with my financial support and backing for my project that would allow me to grab infrastructure and move it forward to my property, which is outside or on the edge of the TMSA, earlier than 20 years, but I couldn't do it now in the 1 to 3 year process. And here, to me, it appears that now government is going to dictate when I can develop my privately held property. That's my problem with the way I'm interpreting this, and I wished I had a proposal to bring forward or to discuss, and I'm still going to keep thinking about it. And one of these mornings, you're going to get an email or a call from me saying, all right, I got it, let's sit down. But I don't have it yet.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I may, actually, it's good that you brought this up, because when we talked about kind of the development of this language in the group, we actually contemplated the fact that the regional plan is updated every 5 years. So while the language in here kind of describes a 20-year horizon, the expectation was this would be revisited every 5 years along with the update. What I don't think is that that's necessarily explicit in the language that we've written down. And at a bare minimum, we need to make that more explicit in terms of that language. So that is maybe half a solution.
Maybe
to
it's
what-
a better
to what you're talking about.
explanation
Right.
then gets it so that the public, which is part of who needs to understand this, the stakeholders, the property owners, the process they can use, they're not being locked out for a 20-year period.
Exactly. And so that, like I said, that was the conversation, was this 5-year piece. I 100% agree we should add that add that language in there, and we're certainly open to conversation if folks think that's a reasonable approach or not.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay. Before we move off of that item, just looking at my notes, question, why does this policy live in population growth? It's linked to RF2 in a lot of ways. Why are those split apart? Was there consideration about having them together or living in the same part of the plan?
Yeah, I think Jeremy Smith, the record, given that we were using the GIS inventory that we have, that we're not really. You've seen that we can model futures. That's one thing, and in any case, GIS is a model, if you will. But really, it's an inventory of how we understand what has been approved through the master plan process, which is the process that this plan participates in. And so it seemed like it was germane because it was based on that same data. But I absolutely can see your point that given that we're talking about regional form and regional land designations, that it could live in the RF section. And I think we did have discussions about exactly that. And to be honest, we didn't exactly know how to approach it. And so we put this out there as a draft to kind of have this conversation and figure out how we want to move forward.
I think that's an important concept, just to make sure to echo that this is a draft, and that's why we're here, and we're working through all of this, so it's a valuable part of the process. So if there aren't any other...
Peter, may I make
Oh,
some
yeah,
comments? Yeah, Chad Giesinger, Planning Manager for Washoe County, for the record. From the county's perspective, we support some kind of metric. Right now, the existing plan, it seems like it's been all too easy to amend over the years and make major expansions of the TMSA with little to no justification, really. And so, wherever we land on this, we really support making it a little bit harder to amend the TMSA and making it more based on actual need and good planning sense. So I just want to put that on the record. And then also, just a question, and maybe this is more for regional forum, what happens when one of the cities does a contiguous annexation outside the TMSA? Does that then result in a special circumstance? How is the TMSA amended once that happens?
I think it's Kim Robinson for the record, if you're looking at me.
I don't know the answer.
I don't know the answer either.
Just another thing to consider is throwing.
Yeah, absolutely, right? That's part of the conversation here on the draft.
You could say this would be
the
one way to
eventualities.
address those types of annexations.
Right.
Yeah.
If I could, for the record, sorry, just to provide a little bit of clarity there. There's a process for annexation in state law, where cities can annex contiguous property. It does not need to be in the sphere of influence, and that's an alternate process in state statute. So until state statute is changed, that will remain a path to annexation.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. That doesn't mean the TMSA have to follow.
I think we support in general what you're hearing and what Chad's saying. I think we're just asking, this exception language is very narrow and talks about maybe a school site, that there probably are other considerations that should be part of the policy. So, there may be other things than a school site that would warrant some type of amendment, just something we're not thinking of now. I hate to just be so rigid that, right down in the next policy, it talks about reducing regulatory barriers to affordable housing. Well, our TMSA is one of those. Maybe it's a conscious one we want to keep, but there may be an affordable housing opportunity that warrants a minor amendment, or I don't know what it might be. I'm just nervous about locking it down on a formula without some broader exception language.
Great. Let's move on then to PG8. Okay, my feedback then on this is, question, does it do enough for affordable and workforce housing? And does there need to be a better connection to regional form policies? Because the affordability is not just a function of the value of the unit, but a function of transportation costs, utility costs, lifestyle costs that are associated with where that unit is. So are we incorporating that into this policy adequately? And I think that the regional plan has, there's an opportunity to reduce those overall costs through regional format matter. Other comments or thoughts on that one? Okay. So before we leave population growth, is there anything that you didn't hear, that you didn't get a chance to talk about, that you think should be in there that's not in there? No? Okay. Let's move on to regional form then.
All right, for the record, Lauren Knox with Regional Planning. So for regional form, a major shift in the concepts that we posed in the draft policies in front of you is having a non-jurisdictional TMSA and quite frankly, a non-jurisdictional plan. So currently, the Truckee Meadows service areas as it exists, there's 3 different areas. There's Washoe County's portion of the TMSA, there's Reno and Sparks' portions of the TMSA. And both the city's portions of the TMSA are also their spheres of influence. So this plan anticipates basically saying, now we're going to have one regional service area, one TMSA. We also tried to refine that TMSA by introducing the concept of tiering and implementing the concept of tiering through the creation of regional land uses. Based on the shift, we also have the removal of the transit-oriented developments and the regional center designations, and that was really based on the shifts of those designations in both of the city's current new master plans. We kind of shifted that a little bit more to this idea of the core area, which is one of those regional land designations, as a way to be looking at infill in this focused kind of area. We also have some changes to the rural area. So that would be to allow 1 unit per 40 acres versus what we have right now, which is 1 unit per 5 acres. And then also allow, so we have 1 per 40 in the plan draft as we have it now, but also allow for the possibility of going 1 unit per 5 acres in certain specified areas through a regional plan amendment process. We've also tried to recognize kind of this freestanding communities idea. So these are these areas that already exist before regional planning. So it's Gerlach, Wadsworth, communities that have existed and are different than the rest of the rural area. So those are really the major shifts in terms of regional form policies. And then in terms of the polarizing issues, this is where a bulk of them come into play. And they're not necessarily specific to certain policies, but general concepts. Some of them are specific policies, for example, densities and intensities. That is based on the chart that is in RF3, so there are concerns over the densities and intensities that are proposed. And we know that with the working group, we've been working through those pieces and trying to figure out what are the best density and intensity to be looking at in those areas. Equal development in the TMSA is also a big polarizing issue right now in terms of the update working group. The regional land designations and kind of where those areas are on the maps, that's another piece that we're trying to work through. You have 2 draft maps in front of you. Draft 1 and draft 2, we've talked about them a few times now. If there are questions, we can definitely talk through them and answer them. And then concerns over the rural area in terms of the ability to develop at 1 unit per 5 acres and doing that kind of clustering idea in the rural area, and that might proliferate more development out into those outer areas. So again, there's quite a few polarizing issues there. We can take questions, comments, anything really at this point.
Well, let's take RF1, 2, and 3 as a block because they go together. Who wants to start on those?
Mr. Chairman, I just got a global question.
Yeah.
If I may, Commissioner Weisky. So since our last meeting and the documents were put together, you have, I'm assuming the working group has had meetings with an S. Of the 4 red flagged issues, have any of those issues been resolved?
I would say fully resolved, not necessarily, but we've gotten a lot closer on some of them. So in terms of the densities and intensities, we've talked about different ways to even potentially implement that policy. So instead of looking at a parcel by parcel or site by site basis, when it comes to us for a conformance review, we've been talking about what if we look at the areas in the aggregate in terms of implementing those densities and intensities. So we're getting closer on that piece. We are also, we have kind of a game plan for how we can look at those regional land designations in terms of the 2 maps and trying to come to the table with a little bit more information in terms of where those regional land designations maybe make the most sense from the jurisdiction's perspective. So we're getting closer there. Equal development in the TMSA is still a pretty polarizing issue. So that's still on the table. And the rural area, we've made some strides in that conversation, but the other 3 have really been more of the focal point in terms of the discussions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll jump in again since that seems to be what I'm doing. These are very important policies. There's a lot of kind of different but related topics bundled into these 3. Just for our overarching goals, we want to continue to prioritize infill development while balancing that with new subdivisions on the edge. They shouldn't go away, but keep encouraging infill. And really our only, from the city of Reno's perspective, our primary ask in this regional plan was for some increased flexibility at the project level in terms of minimum densities, maximum densities, and to move, I think Lauren mentioned it, to more of a higher level regional plan where instead of focusing on densities on every parcel, maybe we look at areas in aggregate and focus on trends and increasing densification, things like that.
Arlo, before you leave that concept, can you, I guess, just clarify where in the policies or where in the plan that doesn't kind of meet the city's desire or expectations, and then kind of what would give us a sense of something to work with?
And we actually have worked up, I don't know if it's ready to discuss, a more detailed proposal. Specifically on policy 1 here, this would shift, the current regional plan calls for 1% of our growth to be outside the TMSA, and this bumps it to 2%. And looking at Jeremy's trend data, I believe we're currently like at 1.5%. Anyway, this kind of calls for more growth outside the TMSA, which we like the 1% better. In terms of policies 2 and 3, I guess 2 issues there. We'd like to essentially combine the employment core and the neighborhood core, because the city's master plan is really looking at a range of uses in proximity, and call it something like a priority development area, kind of the next tier below the core area. We have produced some maps. The maps are probably among the largest concerns, because it would take certain areas that are currently priority growth areas, say South Virginia Street, and they would go from a priority growth area with minimum densities to a low priority area with maximum densities, and I think the landowners need to be engaged in that. So our map would more closely reflect the current plan and our master plan designations.
So before you leave that, bring us up to speed then on the discussions at the staff working group level of how we got to that point where these core areas have kind of been retracted back from what we've traditionally seen in the plan maps with the TOD corridors. What was the discussion there?
Not sure I can do it. I made the maps. Right? Basically I think we were trying to reflect changes in the City of Reno master plan, where there seemed to be more emphasis on urban corridors and the convention center, the convention area center and the downtown center. I would say that we took a stab at it with these two maps, and we were hoping to receive GIS files or drawings or whatever that would describe actually where the jurisdictions thought that the lines would be most appropriate to be drawn. So the attempt really was to sort of lean into the great work that's been done in both the master plan updates. Not sure that we got it exactly right, but that's what we were attempting to do, to really prioritize growth into those areas that seem to be the areas that those plans were indicating growth should be prioritized into. After many discussions, it's clear that there are some other considerations, and I think we're absolutely open to that. And if some of it is some of the existing, what were termed secondary corridors that now maybe are suburban corridors, that's quite possibly very appropriate to just map right on there and include. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be this McCarran ring focused thing. So it was an initial attempt, and really trying to take from what we saw in the new master plan update and reflect it here. We were trying also to relax some of the assumptions around minimum densities that exist in the plan today, which, for example, in I'm jumping ahead here to R3, but in the mixed use core area, right now the plan would call for a minimum of 18 dwelling units per acre, and we've heard multiple times that is not necessarily very achievable, especially on a site-by-site basis. So we actually ratcheted that down to 14, and really we're looking for feedback if that was the right number. I think we're pretty open to this idea of looking in the aggregate at all of these areas, so that we do stay at a regional level, and that we're not trying to dictate site-by-site, project-by-project way how the jurisdictions move forward with development within. But we do want to reinforce the idea that we should be directing future growth into our core area.
So, Sienna, I mean, we went through a great master plan update process at the city. I mean, I think Ed and Kevin, I think you would agree that the plan does a good job of describing how development would be focused towards these desired development areas. So what's the, I guess from your perspective, what's the concern or something that we can do to be a little more aligned with what I perceive as something that the city's already doing, moving in the right direction?
So for the record, Sienna Reed, we've been having ongoing discussions about what are the regional plan designations. We have a mixed use core, and that generally reflects the downtown center for the city of Sparks and their transit oriented development corridor. And then it reflects the work that the city of Reno did to take a slightly reprioritized look at our system of centers and corridors, really trying to focus on where we want the highest density and intensity of development. That doesn't mean that we don't want to promote higher density development and more intense non-residential uses in other places. So it's really just probably, as was alluded to, adding in another category for priority growth areas, as Arlo discussed. But there is a purpose aspect that we also need to consider. So if our mixed-use core areas are supposed to be, where we want that higher density and intensity, maybe they're not transit-oriented from the conceptual outset, but they do support a transit-oriented development pattern and broader mobility options. We think a priority growth area should have similar aspects. You should be looking to promote walkability, alternative transportation options, really, through those higher density developments and other type of the streetscape improvements. So that's something that we think is a productive way forward, at least as it goes with the currently proposed regional plan designations, and certainly the discussion about using the aggregate, that would really provide some additional flexibility to the cities, so that if you have a master plan amendment comes in and maybe it doesn't meet the minimum standards, it meets the aggregate minimum standards. So we think that's a really good place to go, and could also kind of get us away from potential additional processes as the draft 1 of the regional plan is currently proposed. Because right now, if you were to go higher, and you were maybe I'll go the other way. If you were to have a master plan amendment that was lower in terms of your minimum densities, you might have to come out of the boundary of the mixed use core. So we don't really want to do that. We just want it to be more flexible with the goal of promoting infill and redevelopment over time. And so we think there's lots of options to do that within the plan. We do have broader concerns around some of the other regional plan designations. We think there's probably good conversation to be had around tiering and kind of what is the best approach forward with the tiers. We've just very recently been talking amongst ourselves around is there a way to potentially reconceptualize tiers in terms of infrastructure study areas, and being able to say that there are potentially areas where you need that collaborative infrastructure planning effort, but maybe not go through the potential regional plan amendment process associated with Tier 1 and Tier 2. And that's a very new concept that we've just been talking about internally. It definitely needs some additional vetting. But one of the things that we noticed in application of kind of the Tier 1 and Tier 2 areas is that, there's been a lot of planning that's taken place. The areas that were brought into the TMSA many years ago have had a lot of planning efforts over the years. And so we think rather than calling many of them Tier 2, that there might be another way to really get at the heart of the matter around how do we plan for infrastructure investments and extension to some of these areas that maybe don't have those facilities in place at the time or currently.
Mr. Chair? Yeah. Commissioner Chesney, I couldn't disagree more. I believe that the tier system that we have set up currently is effective and it can work. And the use of the amendment process can handle any discrepancies that may occur in this.
Chair Powell, Commissioner Trevilichek. I guess I'm having a hard time understanding when City of Reno, Mr. Sockham, you're asking for more flexibility when in mixed use core and employment core, it says minimum density units, dwelling units per acre is 14 and there's no maximum. How much more flexibility do you want?
Well, the current plan has language that allows local governments to approve alternatives. And when you look at it on a parcel basis, within these core areas, there are going to be properties that are more appropriate maybe for a plaza or maybe for a lower intensity development. So when we lost the ability to do alternatives, which the city has used with some regularity, that was a big concern. But I think we're in agreement if we can move to a broader geographic area where we measure these, then we're fine. Maybe it can even be a bigger number. It's just getting down on the project level and the process impediments it creates with regional plan amendments for a lot more projects and the staff con commitments and all the rest. So at a minimum, keeping the exception language that's in the current plan, but we really do feel that a broader approach to measuring density and tracking trends over time would be very wise and probably more effective than what we've been doing at a parcel level. Hope that answers your questions.
With regards to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Stafford, but what I'm hearing you say more often than not is that you want to stay with the current plan as opposed to looking at a regional plan. Would that be an accurate statement?
I think it would be accurate to say we're not in support of replacing all of the current policies, and maybe some of the policies that have generally been working we could refine more modestly and focus on the areas such as infrastructure planning where everyone agrees, time should be spent and improvements made. So we're not at all saying don't do anything or don't focus on positive improvements. We're a little concerned that by essentially largely redrafting the whole plan, we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And we just don't want to lose the momentum that we've had towards infill development and some of the nuanced policy language that's in place. We just don't want to lose some of that. So we're fine. We like the idea of moving to areas as opposed to centers and corridors. We like moving to a broader geographic approach. We like getting a little, stronger on the growth management, without going overboard. But it's true, I guess, as some of the current policies feel better to us than some of the draft policies, and I'm trying to call out those areas where we have specific concerns and what those concerns are. Hope that helps.
Well, Angela has a comment behind me. I want to just make the point, and maybe there's a question in it, but I think it's important too as we work through these that we remember that we went through a process in terms of getting stakeholder input. We had a number of surveys from we had the community involved. We had different stakeholder input. So there were outputs from those. We saw those at the last meeting, and I guess the question is how are these policies responding to those survey results? I mean, I think we have a broader responsibility as a regional planning agency and as a commission to respond to our constituency, which are the regional stakeholders who we've heard from through the process. So I'd be curious, Kim, if you could kind of respond to that in terms of how you see these policies responding to that multi-year process that we went through.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kim Robinson for the record. We definitely worked very hard at getting the feedback that we received from all of our surveys and engagement pieces into the conversation here. You'll see it in a variety of policies. But an example, let's say, is this conversation around maybe it is a little bit more difficult to see land come in from the TMSA. Well, I have to tell you that growth and growth management was a #1 priority, for folks on our survey pieces. So we would be happy to, my opinion is it's through all of this. And what we could do for you, maybe this would be helpful, is to say, okay, here's kind of our survey results. I know we don't have those to show tonight, and where they kind of made it into these policies. As you know, we had a lot of conversations with the Planning Commission. We had conversations with the Governing Board as well. We've had a lot of conversations with staff over an 18-month period from a variety of jurisdictions and affected entities. This is ultimately our attempt to try and bring all of that together. And if you'd like us to dig deeper into how we made sure that feedback got into here, we'd be happy to do that.
Commission have thoughts on that point? No? Sarah?
Thank you, Chairman Gower. And thank you for bringing that up, because I was going to bring to that point is that the things that rose to the top was infill and smart green growth. So it's just like, so we are addressing that in this regional plan update. And anything that would limit public input would be something that I would not support. I'm a strong advocate if it's a regional plan amendment or any of those processes, the public has to be able to have input. And to go into, this goes back to the city of Reno wanting to reduce the rural area from the proposed 2% to 1% when a rural area development is 1 unit per 40 acres. What is wrong with the 2%?
We have less than that now, and I think the goal of the regional plan is to prioritize development within the TMSA. So our hope is to not move backwards and have a more forward-looking number. I understand the wording's changed a little bit, and that could perhaps be a regulatory limit. But from the data I saw from Jeremy, you know, we're doing better than 2% now, and we want to allow growth outside the TMSA, especially in the outlying areas, but we don't want a proliferation of getting to a lower policy 2.5 acre lots within a commuting distance of town that are going to clog up the freeways. We'd rather see projects come into the TMSA over time and develop at a higher intensity and better utilize the land resources we have. So it's basically just that of, we feel, kind of aligning the policy language to the larger goals that we've all been discussing.
Mr. Chair, if I may address that discussion in terms of the 98% and the 2%. So the way that the policy is written right now in the plan is actually not a policy in the plan. It's a goal of the current 2012 regional plan to have 99% of the growth occur in the TMSA. We actually took that goal, we thought that's actually a great goal, and we want to capitalize on that, and we actually turn it into a policy, a very specific and implementable policy. And that really tightens up what can happen with that. So by tightening that up and making it a policy and having ramifications for not meeting that 98 and that 2%, we did relax it a little bit from the 1% to 2%, and that was also based on the data work that we had at the time, which indicated that in terms of in the rural area, we were seeing about 1.5% of the growth being in that area.
Jeremy Smith, for the record, just to talk about the data a little bit, the past 5 years we've seen 1.5%. Over 20 years it was 2.5%. So we are trending in the right direction, but it you know, over the 20-year period, which is what the policy does consider, it actually was 2.5%.
Mr. Chair, if I may, one of the other conversation points that we had in talking about this, so natural resources and preservation of natural resources ranked extremely highly in all of our survey work and open space. And so the conversation that we had was, as it stands right now, outside of the TMSA, you know, development can happen at 1 per 5 acres. So 1 per 5 acres, cut into these, you know, kind of 5 acres all along the way. The conversation around moving to a 1 per 40 for the rural area with some potential clustering in certain areas, and we think that's still a conversation it's happening right now in terms of what that looks like. But the idea of saying, okay, outside of the TMSA, we're moving to 1 per 40, and we will allow you to do some clustering in certain areas, has tremendous benefits in terms of natural resources, in terms of kind of wildlife, migration patterns, just these other things. And so we were trying to look at it holistically, you know, kind of not just the impact to the TMSA, but we have a lot of rural area, and there's the desire to maintain that and maintain that as well as we can. So that was the other part of the conversation with this.
So I just want to respond to that, Jeremy. And I know, Angela, you have a question. Sorry. Yeah, that was a comment that I made about this, is that, you know, there's really nothing in here that, you know, if someone from the public was reading it and saying, you know, well, why are we doing this? Well, it's really about, you know, meeting our state statute, which is, you know, making sure that we have efficient population growth and protecting our natural resources. So where's that, I know we have a natural resource section, but where's that tie-in with this policy? So someone reading it is saying, okay, this is why we're doing this.
You want to go for it, Nick?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may, Nick Kusha, Dealer Bank, the record. what you're getting here is just really the draft policy. So there's going to be a lot of other content within the plan itself. We're planning to have these types of things within it. A little call-out box to say we had surveys that we got this results from relating to these policies. So it's going to be a lot of the context pieces that hopefully we think we're going to have in the next draft.
Okay.
If I could add to that, please, Jeremy Smith, for the record. In terms of the rural area and the 2% and sort of this idea of clustering in certain areas, the de facto sort of approach that would be in place would be that 1 unit per 40 acres would be what you were allowed. And in order to intensify even to what's allowed today, a 1 unit per 5 acre, you would have to come through the process and do a regional plan amendment and establish a rural development area, I believe we're calling it. And so there would be a specific analysis that would look at, does this actually protect a riparian zone? Or is clustering, does it make sense here because there are benefits? If it's just because people want to develop an area and think they can get more bang for their buck or something, that might not meet the scrutiny that of this board and the elected body as well.
Angela?
Yeah, so one thing, just to go back to that conversation about providing more flexibility. I will say, with our current policies in place, one of the challenges we have with minimum densities in these core areas, it's almost a lot of times causing the opposite reaction. You want to encourage development, but it's forcing people out because they can't meet the code. A couple examples, in Sparks, we have a lot of existing shopping centers, and so they would be in these core areas. They are not currently meeting the 0.5 FAR. When a new user comes in and says, I want to build apartments or a Jack-in-the-Box or anything within that existing shopping center, great, right? It's encouraging infill. However, they can't meet the minimum 0.5 floor area ratio within that shopping center. So it discourages them from coming. The local jurisdictions have kind of come up with more creative ways to still encourage development in these areas, and they do it differently. Reno, if you can't meet the FAR, allows you to go through a special use permit. So you go through a public hearing process, gets you around that 0.5 FAR, but you still have to go through a public hearing process and prove that you're trying to meet the intent. I think it is important that you do keep that flexibility for the local jurisdictions to choose how they want to allow that flexibility, rather than saying, if you can't meet this, you have to go do a regional plan amendment or go to regional planning. That will completely disincentivize infill in these core areas. And then secondly, more of a question, on these tier 1 and tier 2s, you'd mentioned this is areas where you have a lot of these existing planned unit developments, and we're looking at maximum densities of 30 units to the acre or existing. And I'm wondering, from an implementation point of view, does that mean if you're in an existing PUD in tier 1 and tier 2, you can't amend your PUD at all, or you can't amend your PUD to ask for more density?
Right. And the conversation, the conversation has been that if you ask for more density, there's a public process conversation, not a complete 100% no.
Would that require going through Regional Planning Commission for approval?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and that would be on items that we would, sorry for the record, Lauren Knox, that would be on items that we would be reviewing normally. So if there's a master plan amendment associated with that, it would trigger the conformance review and we'd be looking at that policy, or a project of regional significance change in terms of if you already have a project of regional significance or you have a master plan land use that exists, those entitlements, we're not looking to change those or pull back or anything like that. It's if you're looking to intensify, that's when this would kind of kick in.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, Kim Robinson again for the record. Part of the conversation, especially around tier 2, is yes, many things have been approved in that area. Not looking to change any of that, but if the conversation truly is around regional form and pattern and encouraging more density into the infill areas and into the core, then the conversation around increasing the number of units or density on, in the tier 2 area is probably a conversation that should happen at this level in terms of the Regional Planning Commission, because it would mean a bit of a difference in terms of the form and pattern that's being implemented.
If I could weigh in again, Mr. Chair, Chairman Smith, for the record. To your point about the public engagement process and what we learned from the surveys, really lined up nicely with the Nevada Rise statute that governs what we're trying to do. And so that really says to limit premature expansion into undeveloped areas and to foster development into established neighborhoods. So the first draft that shows where tier 1 is, really with the exception of Stonegate, because it's sort of happening, that's sort of the only area where we included basically an undeveloped area in the Tier 1. If you overlay this with where we have sort of trunk level infrastructure, water pipes of 10 inches or greater, sewer pipes of 10 inches or greater, major roads, population density, existing development, it will fit in that light blue area, right? And so that was the first attempt to say, we already have infrastructure and development in these areas. So possibly those are the areas that we should be looking to infill into, right? It's infill because they exist. But we also recognize that our understanding of infrastructure and infrastructure provisioning and service provision as well is not perfect, especially not from the GIS perspective. And that is why we contemplated the idea of a public infrastructure investment plan, where we would understand and do a better job of working with regional partners around infrastructure planning, facility planning. What facilities are planned? Where are they going? What areas will they serve? So capacity type questions, and when would they be available, right? And so that could help to really hone this Tier 1 area to what makes sense in terms of what we understand we can do in the future for facilities planning. We didn't necessarily have that information per se. We have versions of that, varying versions of that across the regional services we look at. So we attempted to do a second draft of the tiering map to take from our work with you guys, the Regional Planning Commission, the Regional Planning Governing Board, and the public around issues, identification, and regional concerns. And so, for example, Spanish Springs, right, is an area where there is quite a bit of master plan land use up there. There's some potential probably to intensify from a land perspective, but all of that sewers to Tumwater, to the Truckee Meadows Water Reclamation Facility. And we know that currently that facility is facing some issues in terms of its capacity. Its permitted capacity is probably greater than its functional capacity right now, although plans are being built to remedy that. We thought, why keep that in the Tier 1 zone if we're really trying to push growth into the core? Let's make sure that we're not asking to intensify up there, because that would take away from our ability to intensify in the areas that we're looking to infill. And so that was kind of the rationale we took to go from draft 1 to draft 2. But really, what we'd like to see is this idea of a public infrastructure investment plan where we don't dictate what needs to happen, but we bring together all of the minds that are working on this, so we really have a transparent understanding of, like I say, where facilities plan to be implemented, what is the area they serve, how much can they serve, bring all that to bear so that we can absolutely right size the Tier 1 zone, so that we can kind of make the conformance process easier through that. If you're in the Tier 1 zone and we've done that work on the front end, you don't have to go through a laborious conformance review process because we understand that we're ready to accept it. But if you are in the Tier 2 zone, that is the area where we don't know, and we should be looking at greater scrutiny and asking for an understanding of how will we serve that. So that's kind of the logic behind the two maps here and what we were trying to achieve. And I think there's more work to be done, always.
Mr. Chair, if I may address the minimum intensity portion of Angela's question here. We have definitely had a lot of discussion about that piece in the working group and how that probably isn't going to work. The latest kind of discussion is that maybe we just nix that whole column instead of looking at FAR. So we are kind of going through those paces and having that discussion, but it's a recognized issue.
Chair?
Yeah.
I'd just like to make a few comments, given the discussion we've been having. There's been some comments about priority growth areas and directing development. I just want to make sure the RPC understands the concept of these tiers. The Tier 1 is, all it's really saying is this is the area where we're going to entertain future intensification, okay? In Tier 2, we still have lots of capacity, lots of things that are already approved, and facility planning is not going to stop for those areas. Okay, it's going to continue because people want to build their projects in those areas. All Tier 2 is saying is that if you want to intensify in this area, you need to get into Tier 1 because we're looking at intensification in areas that Jeremy just described where there's already known excess capacity, right? So it's not so much that Tier 2 isn't a priority development area, because obviously it is, because it has all kinds of development already approved in it. And if you think about it, the entire TMSA is a priority growth area, right? And that's really where we're coming from at the county's perspective.
Other thoughts, questions on this?
Michael Barnes.
Oh, yep.
I'd like to make a comment too, Michael Barnes of Stonegate. We've struggled with some of the zoning, for example, in our development. We have very narrow bands of what we can develop, 4,000 square foot lots, 6,000 square footers. We have 30 acres or greater, and we have 1 acre to the unit. Those are the 4 components to our PUD. What we're finding when we're talking to the market, and again, we're dealing with the home builders, they're trying to find out what can they build to make an affordable home. They all want to be in that market. We all talk about it, and they're all looking for it. And of course, some of it has to do with zoning constraints. We have, for example, a demand for some smaller lots. They're about 2,450 square feet. Well, there's no SF 2.45. So now we're limited to a 30 dwelling units, and it's a maximum. So now I'm at 12 units to the acre, but I only have a certain amount of those that I can build. Now, I'm not trying to say I want to build more units than we have. What I'm saying is I want to be responsive to what the market wants to build, and there needs to be some more flexibility in some of this zoning. So when we come in and say, hey, you know, we're getting a lot of people saying we can hit a $300,000 home or a sub $300,000 home by putting them on a smaller lot, by doing some of these new designs that are coming out from the home builders. You're telling me we have to go to regional planning then and ask to change some of that zoning. And it seems to me that's something that would be better handled by a municipality, understanding it, than asking for regional.
Mr. Chair, if I may clarify for the record. So we, in terms of the Regional Planning Commission, we only, in terms of Nevada revised statutes and what we're allowed to do, we can only look at master plan amendments and projects of regional significance. So we really can't get into that zoning, and I just want to make that clear for the commission and for the record.
Thank you, because I was going to just about say the same thing.
If I could, Chair, I just want to, for the audience.
Two more. Let's go Arlo and Moira, and then I want to move on here.
The Tier 2 as currently structured, we're not supportive of putting approved projects in that Tier 2 for the reasons Michael mentioned and others. A lot of times there can be positives of revisions. We are supportive of better enhanced infrastructure planning, and we'd actually like this public service and facility plan to focus on some of these areas that we're talking about as possibly Tier 2 that would include approved projects to better focus how the infrastructure and services work. So that was the concept Sienna introduced there, and it needs more discussion, but you know, to do infrastructure study areas or something like that effectively for Tier 2 areas needing an enhanced facility planning, seemed like a concept that kind of gets to the core of what we're really trying to do without unduly hamstringing possible positive things in that area. So I just wanted to get that out there, and we'll be sharing maps and whatnot. So it really kind of depends on how that Tier 2 is structured and how it would work in terms of how broadly we would support that designation.
I certainly agree that we need to clarify what the tiers are doing. My understanding of Tier 2 is that the existing entitlement would not be affected by the update simply because it's not a retroactive plan, so we would be moving forward for new projects. That's how we're reading. I would advocate that we really understand how much of a paradigm shift this new regional plan is. It's a courageous move. I really commend the regional staff because we're going back to a criteria-based model versus a geolocation, parcel by parcel, territorial approach, or even a temporal approach. I think that this is truly based in science, and when we did the bright light map and the hexagons, those are the weightings and the ratings that went on to look at each piece of this to say, is it suitable for development or not? So I just wanted to say that. I think it needs to be said as an overarching comment that this is a remarkable change in how we do planning in the region, and it's scientifically based. And so I always go back to that because we bought into the concept at Washoe County. The criteria in Tier 1 is easier. I mean, if you're in Tier 1, you're almost ready, right, to go. But going from Tier 2 to Tier 1 should be harder. You're going to have to meet that level of public infrastructure and levels of service. That's a high bar to meet. And so I think that going back to reminding ourselves that the criteria is in place to ensure that we're all meeting the same development standards, the same levels of service, and that's where the equitable component is truly important. Thank you.
Commissioners, other comments on that one? Let's jump down then. RF4. Kind of in the same boat here, original form. RF5.
If I may, I'm sorry, Chairman Gower.
Commissioner
In terms of RF4,
Yeah.
where there's a statement, it's the second bullet on page 9, where for amendments, and it's the fourth clear bullet, where it says fiscal impact analysis describing the cost to serve the proposal. Is this common for all jurisdictions?
Yes, that was the observation.
Okay. Thank you.
Actually, I have to go back to that too. So for the core area, why would the that analysis, that same analysis that Commissioner Javilcek pointed out, why would that not be required? Is it assumed that it's already done?
Yeah, the idea there was that it was assumed that it was already kind of planned for and a wanted thing, and also to say, we do want these things in the core, we do want to promote this infill, and we don't want to put another barrier into the core area development. So that was kind of the thought process there.
Okay. RF5? RF6?
This one's a biggie for us. I know they're not currently on the map, but this is the one that allows greater intensification outside the TMSA potentially. And when we look at this policy, we think, is this Washoe Valley? It essentially allows water and sewer services outside the TMSA, which hasn't been allowed in the past. And we'd like to support a more targeted approach, geographic approach to allowing those additional intensities, perhaps through the freestanding community concepts, so those would be identified, and certainly with much tighter requirements to move from the rural area to the rural development area. These criteria are really quite easy to meet. And I guess the concern is that we end up with it makes development in the rural area much, much more feasible, going from a 5-acre lot to a 2.5-acre lot. It basically cuts your development costs in half. And we're fine if the county wants to do some of these, but we'd just like it more geographically defined and a stronger regional review process for the creation of these. And kind of a question of, what about Washoe Valley? You know, it's certainly not a 40-acre area. Is the county wanting to lock that down? Is that going to be the next rural development area? Those are kind of some of the concerns for the outlying area, relating directly back to the change from 1% growth to 2% growth in that area, kind of combined with this policy, you know, sets it up for more exurbs that are, you know, an opportunity we should have, but not something we should promote.
May I ask county to, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
May I ask county to respond to that?
So Jack Giesinger, planning manager, for the record. No one's been proposing 2.5-acre lots by themselves. The 2.5-acre lot concept would be the clustering concept that we previously discussed, that Kim so eloquently described. So what the county has proposed in general is taking the existing rural area, which is everything outside the TMSA at the moment, and conceding that allowing the ability to ask for a density of 1 per 5 everywhere in the rural area should be, we should modify that so you can only ask for 1 per 40. But in exchange for that, we want the regional plan to recognize that there could be unique circumstances, unique areas where it's still appropriate to have a 1 per 5 acre density. That's the rural development area discussion. It would require a regional plan amendment going forward, so you would all be having this discussion if one came through. If there were an area where the RDA was proposed. A good example was the recent Marshall Ranch proposal. There's a lot of natural resources in that area, creeks, so forth. They could ask, and they did ask, for density of 1 per 5, and then you could develop a grid of 5-acre lots over that area. And it wouldn't take into consideration any of those natural resources. You would just have 5-acre, 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 septic tank, well. If a particular landowner happened to have enough water rights available to actually propose clustering that density into a more appropriate area, and only way that they could do that clustering because of the health district rules would be to create a private water system, which is allowed by state law right now. Okay, so that's where that concept, that's what the discussion has been about. It's not about establishing straight out 2-acre, 2.5-acre subdivisions in the rural area and having that proliferate and have all these exurbs and all these things. That's not what's being discussed. What's being discussed is, if we're going to change the rural area from what it is now, which is blanket with density of 1 per 5 to this 1 per 40, we need to have flexibility, just like the cities are asking for. They want flexibility in all things to address some of these unique areas that may occur. They may or may not occur. In terms of putting them on the map right now, we think that would be premature because we really don't know where they might pop up. That's been the context upon which we've been discussing this. So we could decide clustering is a bad idea. That's fine. You're still going to be left with the proposals for people to go to 5-acre lots. If this plan is going to say you can't go to 5-acre lots, period, then the county's perspective is, well, then let's not propose the rural area at 1 per 40. So that's the give and take that we're discussing.
Commissioners, thoughts, questions?
Mr. Chair, if I may, just kind of step in on that piece a little bit more, just to explain kind of this rural development area concept. So again, as Chad mentioned, it would be the potential to cluster kind of that overall density of 1 unit per 5 acres. So still trying to maintain that, however, putting some land aside in these open space areas if we are going to cluster more than 1 per 5. And the idea in the rural area in general, which is kind of shown in RF5, is that we cannot allow for the provision of municipal services. So even if there is the establishment of a community water or wastewater system, we do not want that to impact any sort of service provision in the TMSA area. So that was a big part for us in terms of potential rural development area establishment. And again, that would be reviewed and go through the whole regional plan amendment process. So that'll come before this body as well as the Regional Planning Governing Board in order to establish one of those. And we'd be having all of those discussions at that time. And again, we still, if we look at the draft policies we have now, there's that 2% cap in the rural area discussion. So still, it's relatively limited and small in the numbers.
Thank you. All right, let's jump down to RF7, resort services areas. Mainly a carryover from existing plan, right?
Correct.
Okay. How about the freestanding communities policy, RF8? Feedback questions from those, discussion? No? Okay. RF9? No? RF10? I promise not to do wordsmithing items, so I'm like skipping over these.
Well, we will take all of those
Oh, I'll
later.
give them to you later.
I've got
I'll give them to you
wordsmithing
later.
too, but you will take those, yes.
All right, so that gets us to the end of regional forum. Is there anything that the commission wanted to discuss on that, did not see, thought that needed to be addressed? Mr. Gower, I'll chime in here then. I think regional forum, as we've talked about, is the one of the core pieces of the regional plan. I mean, it's the state mandate that's given to the agency, you know, among natural resources and public facilities. But you know, we've been working through a lot of concepts as a community, and I think one of them, two of them maybe, are connectivity And I didn't really see that rise to the surface. I know it's kind of embedded in some of the, the policies and what we're looking for in terms of outcomes, but I didn't see anything that was really overtly, saying that this is what we want as a community. And I could be wrong, maybe I missed it. I'd be curious to get feedback on that.
I agree, I think it can be improved, so I've taken a note on that.
So, I just want to do a check-in here. We've been moving along for about 2 hours, check in with the commission, see if this is a valuable exercise, if you want to take a break, do you want to keep moving forward tonight, do you want to change the approach. This is your chance to chime in on the process. And otherwise, we keep pressing forward.
Let's keep moving forward.
Okay. Public facilities and services.
So human error, I put the wrong slide first, so I'm gonna jump forward and then I'll jump back on the next section, so ignore that, okay. Public facilities and services. So really the big change here was to focus on having a better review of public facilities and services as they relate to our conformance review process. So included in the draft policies are some listed specific regional facilities and services with some specific standards associated with them in terms of what's allowed within the Truckee Meadows service area and what we anticipate, as well as what we anticipate would be good for the rural area. This is a shift away from the existing process. The Planning Commission and the Governing Board have more questions about facilities and service provision and how we're analyzing and reviewing it. So we try to take a different stab at how we look at facilities and services as a whole, in terms of that kind of short-term conformance review process. We also introduced the idea of the creation of a public infrastructure investment plan. That would be a work plan item that we want to really jointly kind of develop this plan, as Jeremy already kind of talked about this piece, but basically looking at where are our regional services, what are our needs, what do we have on the ground right now, and getting that information, that data together, and having those conversations as a whole. So Jeremy already touched on a big part of that, but those are kind of the really key changes for public facilities and services. We also looked at those regional utility corridor and site policies and tried to trim those up a little bit and streamline them a bit, because there are quite a few of them, so we really tried to take a stab at that as well. But those are the main changes in terms of the public facilities and services element in the draft policies.
Great. So let's dive in. PF1.
Can I note on this one too, before we start with the PF1? We know that these standards are a big part of the discussion in the working group right now. We know that they're wrong as they're listed here, and so we know we have a lot of work to do in terms of what those specific standards are. So I just want to note that we know there's issues here in this policy.
Okay,
So,
in that context,
Commissioner
knowing that
Weisky,
they're changing.
When are you going to have it done, and when would you like to bring it back and present it to us in a format that is ready for us? What date would that be?
Day specific, I can't give you right now. We can definitely go back and take a look at kind of the next few meetings that we have with the working group, and we can prioritize this piece a bit more to try and work through kind of these specific standards. I don't have a specific timeline, maybe Kim does.
No, we are working on having meetings with the working group weekly, but also meeting individually with the jurisdictions as often as we can. Everybody is busy, and we appreciate the time that they're providing on this to work on this. Certainly, I think this is one of the biggest priorities that we have kind of facing the working group right now in terms of this conversation. So I'm happy to go back, we can take a look and agree in our next working group meeting to calendar it for a certain date to bring it back to you. I think that would be an appropriate approach.
Mr. Chairman, the reason I asked, Commissioner Weisky, the reason I asked that question is just to get to the point of if there is that much to still be discussed and gotten through this portion of our draft, let's move forward unless somebody has something specific, because we don't know what's going to come back. And we could spend an hour debating something here tonight.
And it could change.
Mr. Chair?
Yep.
If I can say, I think the conversation this evening could be around the concept compared to the specific standards that are within the table itself. So the concept of, is the conversation around concurrency as it is done today, does the Regional Planning Commission feel that the information that they're getting as they're doing master plan amendments enough to be able to make these choices? We've heard maybe not, and so we're trying to propose a different approach. So it would be helpful for staff tonight to understand from a conceptual perspective if there is interest in a shift away from concurrency as done today towards more of kind of meeting a standards level. I think that would be helpful.
Well, to Commissioner Weiske's thing is that, you know, if we're not looking at a total idea here in the public facilities, maybe that is tabled. But for conversation, since you have gaps or you've got some work to do, and I've brought this up when we've had our individual meetings, is stormwater runoff. Because when I look at the NRS, it addresses stormwater runoff, and that's not in flood control. And then what you say here in red, should this, police and fire's out of the statute, it's out of the jurisdiction of the statute for the regional planning.
That's right.
Am I correct? Okay, so come out.
Yep.
We haven't addressed, Commissioner Chesney, we haven't addressed in this stormwater.
Right.
That's what was just brought up.
That's what they just,
I just brought that up,
discussed it.
Commissioner Chesney, I'm sorry if you didn't hear.
Got 2 for stormwater.
Okay, so back to Kim's point in terms of the concept of concurrency, if there are any feedback on that, relative to your decision-making on the commission, this is a little bit of a shift away from that approach. I've heard feedback on that.
Commissioner Weisky, I'd like to see
desired.
it go to specific. I think it's easier for the public to understand. I think it will be easier for planning commissioners to understand and make decisions on and be able to justify their vote and their opinion, or even starting their line of questioning. So I think that rather than, I'm, for those of you who just met me tonight in the last half hour, I'm a black and white kind of a person. So the less gray in the world is better.
Okay, so let's move through these then. PF2, that's where you talk about the public infrastructure investment plan. My thought on that, and this is sort of nuanced, but this is my opinion. My opinion, a policy should not discuss developing something. That's a procedural. That's something that's procedural. As a policy is that the agency would maintain, for example, a public infrastructure investment plan. So there's some sort of action there, assuming that it's in place. Because what happens once it's developed?
Sure.
If I could, Chair?
Yeah.
I think the concept of enhanced facility planning we're all on board with. I think it's just the language, making sure that the service providers and local governments maintain jurisdiction over their specific funding priorities and where the budgets are spent in accordance with a broader coordinated regional framework. Some of the language started to sound like the regional planning agency would decide which sewer gets built where, or more of those detailed local government decisions. So that's really in the nuance of the language, and it probably applies to the policy before as well.
All right, let's jump down then to PF3. My feedback is that the reclaimed water component, which is the second sentence of that, should be a separate policy. PF4. So the last sentence in that PF4, CIPs must align with the public investment plan for facilities and services upon its completion. What does that look like? Is there a conformance review of those plans, or what is the procedural piece?
Right. And I don't think that we had gotten to the place of what that implementation piece looks like, so it's a fair question that you ask, and we should address that in draft 2.
That gets to my prior point on CIP priorities, broader regional framework, specific CIP items, level of governments.
Yeah.
Mondo Ornelas, City of Sparks.
Just yell at me or throw something.
I think a comment here on PF4, and it applies generally to PF2. I think there's merit to a higher or enhanced level of regional infrastructure planning. The general concern just has to do with how these policies would be implemented. I think to me it seems like a pretty heavy lift for regional planning, given their limited staff and the composition of staff. Currently, for example, have engineers on staff. And for example, PF4, there's a lot of entities that have CIPs, and if you're reviewing them all every year, that could absorb all of regional's time for big chunks of every year. So I think we need to figure out how to do this in a way that it makes sense and is appropriate. But there's no doubt in my mind that there's room for better, more coordinated infrastructure facilities planning at the regional level.
Well, Armando, what's the solution to that then? Obviously, regional doesn't have engineers, but if there is a desire to have these more regionalized plans or understanding of what that infrastructure looks like, how do we provide that value at the regional level?
Yeah, I haven't thought it all the way through, so I don't have a throw together solution. Again, I think we need to find what level of review and what level of coordination and how in reality do we carry that function out on an annual basis. Because it's an intent. Just developing a CIP for us takes a bunch of staff, a bunch of time. Right. So it's a big lift.
Yeah. Okay. Where are we? Let's see. PF6. Sorry, 5.
Carryover.
Yep. PF6? No? PF7? Okay. PF8? 9?
Chair Gower?
Yeah.
All the school district items, those are the new numbers that we just agreed on, or are those the numbers to still be debated, discussed, and decided on?
Mr. Chair, if I may, the 2 items on school district, these are carryovers. The one that you have been in discussion about is still in conversation. It's coming back to the governing board on probably May 23rd for another conversation. They asked for a continuance.
If and when that decision is made, that would roll over into this document then?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Gower, I'm going to jump in here. It's not a particular policy, but if we are going down the road of prioritizing infrastructure in Tier 1 areas, then there could be a stronger connection to this particular policy regarding the RTP and the prioritization of transit, bike ped, and connectivity in those Tier 1 areas. RTC wants to respond to that.
Well, sure. Dan, just planning manager at RTC. I was just kind of following up on Armando's comment, Angela and I had a little side conversation, but, you know, when it comes to capital investment programs and, you know, just prioritizing some of these, you know, every entity goes through pretty extensive public comment and gets approval for their own board. So I'm struggling a little bit, I guess, to determine what regional's role would be within that and in the review process. And so, I don't know, I guess that's just my 2 cents for the record. I don't really have a quick and fast answer to your question, Commissioner.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, I mean, you know, maybe the thing to do would be align some investment or to develop some investment goals that we as a region can agree on in terms of priorities, right? And then that's the simplest sort of yardstick by which to measure something. You know, that I'm kind of thinking out loud, so I don't want to say that idea has necessarily any significant amount of merit to it, but I think if what we're trying to do is prioritize, you know, investment and direct it to certain areas versus others, then maybe we ought to say so, right? And, you know, if it goes into the regional plan, it's because we achieve some level of consensus around it, and then we'll go from there.
Great point.
Commissioner, if I may, just I think one of the things that we've noticed over the years in looking at the information is that sometimes there are spatial mismatches in where we have certainly existing capacities. So one example that we use frequently is South Truckee Meadows has a very good sewer collection system. So, you know, it seems like from that variable, it would support growth. But for a long time, we were facing a school overcrowding issue. So from that variable, it would not. And so I think some entity should be looking at alignments and mismatches, and our NRS specifically contemplates our agency as that entity.
So, yeah, I mean, so what's the, I mean, I think Armando made a good point, Jeremy, you make a good point. I mean, is there a, are we losing anything by, you know, going down the road that Armando's talking about, of basically saying so, saying what we want to achieve as a region and, you know, putting it into the plan, and then trying to make sure that I phrase this right. I mean, can we achieve the same goal, basically, if we just, you know, say it in words as opposed to, you know, having these complex review requirements? Is there still the conformance requirement? I mean, maybe this is a legal question, I don't, you know.
Chair Gower, Jessica Carney for the record. We could treat it similarly to how the NRS treats the current division of master plans come up for conformance review. And then it's incumbent upon the local jurisdictions to ensure that their development codes, zoning ordinances conform. So regional doesn't go in and make sure that development codes or zoning conforms, but there is an expectation that the locals will ensure it does. So we could do something similar here. You have the public infrastructure plan that is adopted by regional with all the local support. And then the locals, we could have a rule in here that they will make sure that their CIPs align with that PIP and leave it at that. So that regional's not engaged in the business of trying to do conformance review of CIPs. Just a suggestion.
And that is what we have contemplated in PF4, is exactly that piece there, is that sentence in there aligning kind of CIPs with that public infrastructure investment plan. The rest of that item in regards to CIPs is actually carryover policy from our current iteration of the plan. So it does get at what Ms. Prunty is saying.
Chair?
Yep.
For the record, Sandra, if I could just weigh in, state law is already constructed to provide that vertical consistency from the regional plan to the local government master plans and affected entity facilities plans. And then our development codes, our CIPs, those each need to already align with our master plans. So it's not necessarily building that out. We have that in place. I think the question is, what's the appropriate mechanism to do so? We do have some concerns about what it would mean to submit a CIP. Those have been, voiced roundly for conformance review. So we look forward to what might be an alternate process.
Great.
Mr. Chair, can I just follow up to Dan just getting RTC? And it's kind of cyclical for at least the RTC, because we do rely on TMRPI to provide a lot of the land use data that we use for our transportation modeling and decisions. So it's kind of already by right, we've taken the data that's kind of in alignment with their plan in a direction when we are kind of formulating our plan as well. Not to get into the weeds, but it's kind of this, mutually, we have this mutual relationship that we kind of develop our plan in concert with regional.
And that's the same for the water planning, right?
I was reading my notes as he was speaking, so I didn't catch everything he said. I apologize for that.
His comment was that it's kind of cyclical because regional planning provides the data that supports RTC's planning, and I was just making the comment that it's a similar process.
Similar
water
in
planning,
the water
that
planning
there's
world.
An integrated data, sharing process going on.
Right. The regional water plan has to be submitted and found in conformance with the regional plan, as you know. And so when we develop our plan, it's required that we're consistent with the regional plan and with local government master plans, and then facilities plans for the providers as well. So I agree, the cyclical nature of it is similar. I guess a question that I would have as far as developing the public infrastructure investment plan is how would that plan be developed? My assumption would be that you would have the service providers at the table, and maybe that their CIPs would be the basis for maybe rolling up, what could be an infinite number of line items from a CIP into something that would be generalized as, something as basic as, here's a facility that is planned for an expansion, say, and I'm thinking about this in the water world, so maybe it's a wastewater treatment plant. Then here's the area that it would serve, and here's the magnitude of the expansion. Maybe it goes from 2 million gallons a day capacity treatment to 4 million gallons a day. And then here's the timing that might be available. And then there would be tentacles into, okay, well, if you upgrade a wastewater treatment plant, how does a collection system look? Can it convey all of the wastewater to the plant, or would there need to be expansions there? And then how does effluent management work? Is there some place to reuse or dispose of the effluent afterwards? So all of those little nuances would have to be rolled into this. But summing up, I think that it could be a heavy lift, but I think that it could be something that could be done with the assistance of the service providers and maybe some consultant help if there was budget. It's not dissimilar from the goals of the regional water plan. So, and I've been at the table discussing this and trying to, refine the concepts with staff, and I'm committed to continue to do that as long as I'm around.
He's retiring in February 2019, by the way, so we're done by then.
I think it's a doable concept, but the devil's in the details.
Yeah. Okay. Good discussion on that. PF10. PF11. My favorite, utility corridors. 12, 13, 14, 15.
Just blew right past them.
Yeah. They're really well written.
Industry must like it, huh?
Yeah.
16. PF 16. Yeah, I'm going to stop there on PF 16. So this is essentially a carryover from policy 391 in the regional plan. And I can tell you that a number of years ago, we went through a process, and a lot of the people in the room were involved in that process, talking about utility corridors, and aesthetics came to the surface as a concept that we discussed. Commissioner Weisky, you might remember that. And cost was a component that was discussed. The challenge with incorporating costs into a regional plan policy is that it's my understanding that costs associated with any sort of energy project is not the jurisdiction of regional planning. It's PUC, Public Utilities Commission. They make the determination of the allocation of costs. And aesthetics is not a consideration when making a justification for undergrounding a power plant. I think we all like to see that. I think it'd be great, but the allocation of costs is basically one direction. Whoever wants it undergrounded gets to pay for it. So I don't know what the rationale is necessarily for having a policy that says this.
So, Mr. Chair, if I can address
Yeah.
kind of what that rationale piece was. So what we've seen is a significant shift in these utility corridors going underground in terms of what the local government master plans have and what we've seen come through as a regional plan amendment. What the current policy language has is that it can only be undergrounded in instances where there are safety issues that are identified. So we've seen kind of a shift in trend in terms of wanting to underground for more reasons than just safety. And then in terms of that allocation of cost piece, and I wasn't here for this, so there was my understanding is there was a case quite a while back where there was a line that was put underground, and then that cost was spread out to the rate basin in that area in terms of undergrounding that line. And there were concerns with the representation of the people paying for that increased rate not being heard by one of their elected officials. So with that, what we wanted to do was require that all undergrounding, this is already a requirement, but all undergrounding of lines happens at the regional planning governing board level so that there are elected officials able to look at and talk about those costs and if they come up. But I hear your point, and perhaps there's more work to do on this piece.
Elected officials can talk about it all they want, but unless they have a strong lobby with the utility commission, then they're not going to get anywhere. Jim, I mean, am I off base here?
Mr. Chair, I know this was agendized for a meeting between the commissioners, so I kept a little quiet and I'll ask the question. But I was there, and what occurred on this specifically is that the Washoe County Planning Commission required a developer to underground a portion of a transmission line, and it ended at that meeting. And then the Public Utilities Commission required the entire rate base of Washoe County to pay for that undergrounding on their utility bill. So the reason that this was changed was so that elected officials had to review the requirement for that to be undergrounded, so that if it was spread across the entire rate base, it would be a decision of a body elected by the whole rate base.
And you don't think that we're getting into dangerous territory by putting in things like aesthetics into regional plan policies related to undergrounding transmission lines?
Potentially, the Washoe County Planning Commission at the time was getting into a dangerous spot when they required that and required the entire rate base to pay for that. And that's why that was put in, and that was a direction by the governing board.
Mr. Chair, if I may, Jessica Prenti for the record. I'm not exactly sure where the lay of the land is here legally. I suspect it's somewhere in between the planning, this body, and the Public Utilities Commission. And I'm going to take a look at this, and I'll provide you some feedback.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Chair, just really quickly, the conversation also, Kim Robinson, the conversation also is, should the language be so restrictive, as to say this is the only reason that you can underground? Because again, we have heard from a couple of the jurisdictions that there's maybe some desire for change there. So that was the other piece.
Great. Okay. We've reached the end of public facilities. Anything that you did not see, wanted to see? Any other comments? No? Okay, well, I'm going to chime in then with two things before we move on. I did not see anything in public facilities related to climate resilient infrastructure. And I did not see anything in public facilities related to schools, related to transportation, and a desire to reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to the placement of schools and school transportation infrastructure. And I know that Air Quality Management District is sitting in the room, and they have an ozone advance plan that could use a lot of support at the regional level.
Thank you, Chair Garrett. As I was looking at renewable energy generation, those are top issues for me as well.
Okay. Are we good to keep moving on? We want to stop, we can stop.
When you say stop, stop for the night or stop for a break?
Yes.
It's kind of like when you're on a car trip, you know?
Are we there
It's
yet,
like,
Dad?
do you stop, or you just keep like, oh, I can make the next one. I can make the next hotel.
I think you're getting into danger area.
I feel like we're on that car trip.
I think so too.
Mr. Chair.
So if we stop, I kind of want to stop.
Yeah. If we stop, I kind of want to stop.
I want to stop and go to my hotel on the car trip.
You want to stop for the evening, not stop for a break.
Mr. Chair, you have a meeting on May 8th where we can do the last two sections of these policies.
Okay, look for.
Sure, would you like a motion?
I would like a motion on that, Commissioner Chesney.
I would move that we finish the next two sections on the meeting of May, but continue this to May.
Great, have a motion, how about a second?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so that leads us nicely into our next item then, which is 5B, discussion and possible action regarding the regional plan update schedule.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yep.
Thank you. So if you may remember, 2 weeks ago, we provided you with some information, documentation, and told you that you would have the opportunity to provide us any feedback you'd like to on the process or the timeline for the regional plan update at this meeting. If you would like to provide any feedback on that, you can do that today with us. As you know, it is April 24th, and we have had the special meeting on polarizing issues. We're 3/5 of the way done, which is very exciting. You may also know that we'll continue to work with the working group between now and your May 8th meeting to continue working on the list. Just so you know, the conversation around process and timeline for the regional plan update will be discussed at tomorrow's governing board special meeting, and we anticipate some direction from the governing board tomorrow, if they so desire. So tonight is your opportunity to provide any feedback to not only staff, but if you would like to say something for us to take to the governing board tomorrow on this item, we'd be happy to transmit that information. So turn it over to you.
Okay. So based on our discussion, our work tonight, how does the commission feel about, one, the schedule, and two, feedback to give to the governing board relative to our work and what we have ahead of us?
Mr. Chair, Chesney here. I think sooner or later we're going to have to dig in and decide how much more time we're going to need on this. I only have 4 years left, and I'd like to get it done before then. And it appears that we're not moving along very fast. So I think that the governing board needs to give us some pretty positive direction on how much more time we're going to spend on this.
So I'm going to throw that back at you, Commissioner Chesney. The Regional Planning Commission is the body that's in charge of doing the update. So it's our legal counsel, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's our prerogative to say to them how much time we need to get them a plan that they can approve.
And what do we think collectively? How much time do we need?
Chair Gower and to my fellow commissioners, I believe we talked about this briefly at our last meeting, and I think that, and I don't want to put words in the mouths of my fellow commissioners, but I believe we were, and Commissioner Weisky was very eloquent in his statement, but we need the time to make sure that we're doing an appropriate review, but to prolong this just to be prolonging it is irresponsible on our part. And so if we're looking at, a few months extension, yes, anything beyond that, I believe would be irresponsible. We are being responsive to our staff has been doing amazing work and are nearing exhaustion. And so at some point, when people are coming in and out of the process or coming into the process and wanting to do large changes, that reflects badly on the work that we've been doing for the last 2 years. And with the community input and stuff, we do have to honor that, and we do have to deliver something to the public. So what is staff, you guys have some thought of a timeline, or not? You must have some idea.
Mr. Chair, may I defer while other planning commissioners speak?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Weisky, I'll bide a little time there for Kim, okay? A couple of things to staff, and they're all meant positively. I agree with Vice Chair Chavilicek that you guys are doing a great job. We know you're burning the candle at both ends, and you're getting tired of this one. You want to get back into the real job. But it's what's before you, and we need you to keep pushing on, okay? We need the work group to understand that now the time frame is of the utmost importance, and when you have disagreements, ladies and gentlemen, you need to sit down and you need to work through those disagreements so that staff can get us a final draft or sit down and bring us the issues and let us make a decision for you. Okay, it's to that time. And that way we can do our job and you guys continue to do your job, and we can have a light at the end of the tunnel. Okay? And with that being said, I don't think that we should miss a scheduled meeting between now and the day that this is over. And if that scheduled meeting, Kim, is for nothing more than an update on issues that are not being resolved, that we need an update on, then it's a short meeting, but that's what's brought to the table. And if we can offer anything, or if we can go back and talk to our respective agencies with some suggestion or comments or something, maybe that's how we as commissioners best do our job and help facilitate this along to its completion.
Yep.
My opinion. Thank you for letting me share it.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you for that.
Did I take up enough time?
I could add some additional stuff to that. So if you need a few more seconds, if I may, Chair Geller. In just is to remind everyone that is present, and it has been said a number of times, and our council has said this a number of times, this is the jurisdictional body that makes the decisions. And so I would reemphasize what Commissioner Weisky said is, all of you in the working group, all of you that are meeting with other entities and stuff, roll your sleeves up, get to work, and come up with some suggestions and come back to us. We're doing that too. We're meeting regularly with planning staff, and this is your job. We're paid to come to a meeting, and it isn't even payment. And it's the amount of work that we're having to do as citizens is a really big lift, and we're committed to that. So roll up the sleeves and get to work.
So let's walk through it just in terms of the meetings and expectations for our upcoming meetings. And hopefully that'll help us get a better idea of the timeline looks like.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So your next meeting is May 8th. You have a couple of regular items on that meeting, and now that we have decided to break for the evening, there will also be natural resources and regional coordination on that meeting. We are asking for a special meeting on May 22nd. There will be an item on that agenda regarding the geothermal plant. That is also the presentation of the regional strategy for housing affordability. It's the final draft. There will be a regional town hall announced for the next day where that gets rolled out. So that is part of the conversation on the 22nd. There's also space on that agenda to be able to have more conversation on the regional plan update. Your next meeting after that, I believe, is June 12th. If I'm wrong, it might be the 13th, but it's right in there, June 12th, June 13th. And so the conversation that staff internally had been having was whether or not to ask to use the reserve date in June and have another couple of weeks. Given the conversation tonight, I'm wondering if we keep this June 12th meeting and we also, and the reserve
Yes.
date,
Yes.
so that those happen. Right, my recommendation would be to do that for July as well. The conversation has been for a while that this would be wrapped up in June. So I've heard a few months, I've heard a couple months, I've heard, kind of different things along the way here. If we take it from the place of June was the conversation of where it would end, seems to me that a couple or a few sounds like August or September in terms of the conversation and getting this done. In terms of can staff be able to manage to make that timeline, I would say yes. I would say that part of the issue is that, as I mentioned, all the staff in the room is very busy, and so sometimes it's very difficult to be able to get people together for as many conversations as we might like. So with the understanding that that's also a bit of a concern, and a fair concern, I'm not saying that it's not, I might err on the side of September just from that perspective. That's my best feedback.
Chair Gower.
Yeah.
Commissioner Weiss. Kim, you have a regional governing board meeting tomorrow?
That's correct.
I would ask that our closing comments this evening be shared
Yes.
with regional governing board tomorrow, so that we have our political entities, our governing bodies at home, if you will, either in agreement with us or calling us, in the case of Reno, to the 15th floor and having a discussion with us.
Sure. Okay. So, Mr. Chair, it sounds like we will provide the comments. Is there specific, something specific that you want? Okay.
I was gonna ask that question. So do we want to provide an amount of time, a month, or does the commission just want to forward its, as Commissioner Weisky said, the discussion and feedback, comments?
Chairman Gower, I'm going with Commissioner Weisky, and I can be a great person, but at some point I do like to come to closure. So I would like to say nothing later than, I don't want to define us, but I would prefer August, but if it has to be September, nothing beyond that.
I would support that, Commissioner Jabilczek. I think we need to set a goal for ourselves, and I think that based on what I'm hearing, August is a reasonable goal to set, a target that we continue working towards.
So that can be conveyed to Governor.
Thank you.
And that's the final.
Final.
The
Final.
RPC's recommendation for a final regional plan in August.
Okay.
You need a motion on that?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. All right, let's move on to item number 6, reports, members and directors' reports.
Mr. Chair, I just went over the dates, so.
Yeah, you sure
we're
did.
good. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Legal counsel report.
Done the reports, just finding for the record, just like to remind you about that.
Yes. All right. You're indicating for our item 5 comments, or just public comment in general?
Public comment period, yeah. I'm not sure if there's any members
comments?
He did at the beginning.
We had one.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do item 7, requests for future agenda items. I think we know what we're doing for the next time.
I was like, are you kidding me?
All right. Public comment. Item 8. Anyone wishing to make a comment? Nope. Okay. Written correspondence.
There is none.
Okay. I have an motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Good night.